One small warship is about to do what no navy has ever done. It is the 18th of May, 1944, and she is clearing Purvis Bay in the Solomon Islands, bound north toward the Bismarck Archipelago, with two sister ships alongside her. Her name is USS England. By the time she returns, she will have sunk 6 enemy submarines. No ship before her had done it. No ship since has matched it. Hold on to that number, because everything in this story bends toward it. 6 submarines in 12 days by one small ship built in a hurry, named after a man who never got to see the war end. To understand why that name mattered, you have to go back 2.5 years, to a Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. Ensign John Charles England had turned 21 4 days earlier. He was not supposed to be in the radio room of the battleship Oklahoma that morning at all. He had traded the watch with a friend so that he could spend the coming days with visiting family. It was the 7th of December, 1941, and just before dawn he reported for duty anyway, because a trade was a trade. The Oklahoma was an old ship by then, a veteran of the First War, a ship that had once screened convoys across the Atlantic and carried Americans out of danger during the Spanish Civil War. She lay moored that morning along Battleship Row with the rest of the Pacific Fleet's heaviest ships, engines cold, crews at breakfast or still asleep, on a Sunday that every man aboard expected to be as quiet as the one before it. None of that history, and none of that quiet, mattered at 10 minutes to 8, when the first torpedo struck her. 3 torpedoes hit the Oklahoma in the opening minutes. The hull rolled onto her side with a speed that outran any drill anyone aboard had ever run. In the radio room, England grabbed for a handhold as the deck itself became a wall. The order came down to abandon ship. Most men who could still move were already trying to get topside, into open water, away from a hull that was going over. England went the other way. He went back into the flooding corridors, found men who could not find their own way out, and brought them up. Then he went back again. Then a third time. Each trip the water was higher, and the list was steeper, and the path back was harder to find than the last one. On the 4th trip into the ship, he did not come out. The Oklahoma capsized within 12 minutes of the first hit, 8 torpedoes in her by the end, and 429 of her crew went down with her. Ensign John England was one of them. The next day, President Roosevelt spoke to the nation. For a country that had spent 2 years trying to stay out of a war on the other side of 2 oceans, this had just become personal. It would be 2.5 more years before the name England meant anything to the war again, and by the time it did, the war itself had changed almost beyond recognition. The ocean where the Oklahoma once lay on her side was now the far edge of a battle that had crawled, island by island, thousands of miles closer to Japan itself. The men who fought the middle years of that climb did it in places most Americans back home had never heard named before the war. Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, the Bismarck Archipelago, a scatter of jungle-covered islands and reef-strewn straits where a ship could vanish from a chart as easily as from a battle line. It was in these same waters, off these same coastlines, that USS England would eventually make her name. Now move forward to 1944. By that spring, Japan's Navy was still dangerous, still proud, but it was no longer the Navy that had struck Pearl Harbor. American shipyards were turning out aircraft carriers and pilots faster than Japan could match them, and the men making that calculation in Tokyo knew it. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was not ready to concede the ocean. He had taken command that same spring, stepping into a post that put the whole of Japan's remaining naval strength in his hands, at the exact moment that strength had never been thinner. And he answered it by staking everything on a single decisive battle, rather than a slow, losing retreat. He drew up a plan called Operation Ago, a single decisive battle near the Mariana Islands, where Japan would throw its first mobile fleet, its land-based aircraft, and its long-range carrier planes at the American fleet, before it could strike first. By the spring of 1944, the war in the Pacific had become a slow, grinding advance, measured in islands rather than miles. Tarawa, the Marshalls, Truk, raided from the air until it was no longer the fortress it had once been called. Each step brought American forces closer to the inner ring of islands Japan considered essential to hold, the Marianas among them, close enough to put American bombers within reach of the home islands themselves if they fell. Toyoda understood exactly what losing that ring would mean, and he intended to stop the advance with one battle rather than watch it continue island by island until there was nothing left to defend. A plan like that lives or dies on one thing: knowing where the enemy is before he knows where you are. And that was Toyoda's problem. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft could no longer fly freely over water the Americans now controlled from the air. Japanese radio interception, once a real source of warning, had been all but blinded by improved American encryption. Toyoda had one tool left that could still slip through unseen: submarines. There was a cost to that choice, and Toyoda knew it even as he made it. Every submarine Japan lost was a submarine Japan could not easily replace. American shipyards by the spring of 1944 were building destroyer escorts and Liberty ships and aircraft carriers on production schedules that read more like a factory floor than a naval program. Japanese shipyards, squeezed by shortages of steel, fuel, and skilled labor, and hunted along their own supply lines by American submarines, built far fewer hulls, far more slowly, and had no realistic way of making up a loss in a matter of weeks. A picket line built from 7 submarines was not 7 boats Toyoda could spend and simply order 7 more. It was very nearly all he had left for the job. On the 15th of May, 7 submarines of the 6th Fleet's 7th Squadron left Saipan, boats of the Roe class, smaller coastal submarines built for exactly this kind of patient, hidden work. Their voyage would take 6 days and cover roughly 650 miles, ending on a 200-mile stretch of open water between New Guinea and the Caroline Islands. Toyoda called it the NA line. Spread that thin across that much ocean, the boats were not there to sink anything, not there to repeat the kind of raiding that had made Japanese submarines feared earlier in the war. Their orders were simple, almost passive by comparison. Find the American fleet, report it, and let Toyoda spring his trap using every other ship and aircraft he still had. The submarines themselves were meant to be nothing more than eyes on a very long stretch of empty ocean. Expendable eyes, if it came to that, as long as the warning reached Tokyo first. Here is what Toyoda did not know as his submarines took up their stations. The Americans were already reading along. At Pearl Harbor, the cryptanalysts of Fleet Radio Unit Pacific had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to follow Squadron 7's 6-day voyage almost as it happened. They watched 7 submarines take up a picket line meant to be invisible, and they knew exactly where that line was before some of the boats had even finished getting into position. The Americans did not need to guess where Japan's eyes in the Pacific would be. They already had the coordinates. From Purvis Bay, 3 Buckley-class destroyer escorts got underway to do something about it. Escort Division 39, the USS George, the USS Raby, and the USS England, the ship that carried the name of the ensign who never made it out of the Oklahoma. England herself had been in commission for barely 5 months, placed into service that December under a young captain named Walton Pendleton, a graduate of the Naval Academy from the class that had come up in the years right after the First War. Pendleton was not a man who needed to prove himself by taking every wheel and every order into his own hands. He trusted his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, to actually con the ship through her attacks, while he stood back, watched the whole board, and gave the order that mattered most: when to fire. The Buckley class itself is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about the 2 navies fighting this war. Over 100 of these ships were built in the space of about a year, 1943 into 1944. Hulls turned out at a pace no shipyard in Japan could have matched for a vessel this size. They were originally meant for convoy escort, longer and faster and tougher than the class that came before them, carrying sonar and radar as standard fittings rather than rare upgrades. Where Toyoda's Roe-class boats were a resource he could not replace, Buckley-class destroyer escorts were closer to a resource America could mass-produce faster than the enemy could sink them. And bolted to the deck of every one of them was a weapon that had already earned a fearsome reputation among submarine crews on the other side of the world: the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a British invention, developed by the Royal Navy's own weapons engineers after an earlier design, the Fairley mortar, failed to deliver what escort crews needed. Building on ideas about spigot-fired projectiles first worked out between the wars, the design that emerged in 1942 solved a problem that had haunted anti-submarine warfare since the First War. A destroyer hunting a submarine with ordinary depth charges had to run directly over its target to drop them, and in the last seconds of that approach, the exact moment that mattered most, the ship lost sonar contact with the very thing it was trying to kill. The Hedgehog solved that by firing forward instead of dropping down. 24 small projectiles arced out ahead of the bow in a tight ring, while the ship's sonar stayed locked on the target the whole time. The Royal Navy recorded its first Hedgehog kill against a German U-boat within a year of the weapon entering service, and by the time it reached the Pacific, fitted to American destroyer escorts, crews on both sides of the war had learned to respect it. Unlike a depth charge set to explode at a chosen depth whether it hit anything or not, a Hedgehog round only exploded on contact. Packed with 35 pounds of Torpex, roughly half again as powerful as the same weight of TNT, one hit could open a submarine's pressure hull in seconds. A miss made no sound at all. There was no reassuring boom to tell a nervous crew they were close. Silence meant nothing. A hit meant everything. By the time it reached the Pacific, the Hedgehog was already a proven weapon rather than an experimental one, credited across both oceans with sinking far more submarines per attack than depth charges ever had. It was not issued to a handful of specialist ships. It was standard equipment, bolted to the bow of destroyer escort after destroyer escort as American shipyards turned them out. The same weapon in the same mounting on ship after ship, so that any one of 100 nearly identical hulls could do to a submarine what only the most skilled depth charge crews had ever managed before. That, as much as anything Pendleton's crew did personally, is the quiet center of this whole story. This was not a rare stroke of genius. This was an ordinary weapon made common enough that an ordinary crew on an ordinary ship could use it to do something extraordinary 6 times in less than 2 weeks. Life aboard a destroyer escort on a submarine hunt in the tropical Pacific was not the kind of thing that made for dramatic footage between the actual attacks. Heat below decks that never fully broke even at night. Days spent at general quarters or close to it, snatched sleep in a bunk still warm from the last man off watch. The constant low hum of the ship's own machinery blending into the background until a sonar contact cut through it, and every man aboard came alert at once. It was tedium built directly on top of the possibility of sudden violence, and Escort Division 39 lived inside that combination for 12 straight days without a real break. That silence would matter more than anyone aboard England yet understood, because over the next 12 days, her crew would have to learn to read it. Before we follow her into that hunt, one short thing. If you want stories built on research like this one to keep getting made, the way to tell me is the like button under this video. It costs you nothing, and it tells the people who care about this history that an audience is still listening. Tap it now, then stay with me, because England is about to find her first target. Before the hunt itself, it helps to understand the tool the hunters were actually using to see underwater at all. Sonar, what the British called ASDIC, worked by sending a sound pulse out into the water and listening for the echo that bounced back off anything solid enough to reflect it. A trained operator, headphones clamped tight, could judge range and bearing from the timing and the pitch of that echo, and could just as easily lose it the instant a submarine turned broadside, dove into a thermal layer, or simply held still enough to blend into the noise of the ocean itself. It was a skill built entirely on sound and patience, nothing to look at, nothing to confirm with the eye, and every single kill that followed depended on a handful of sonarmen doing that job correctly in the middle of a fight. The first target found was not even one of Toyoda's picket boats. It was the I-16, an older fleet submarine with a genuine claim to history. Years earlier, she had launched one of the midget submarines meant to slip into Pearl Harbor ahead of the air attack. One small vessel among the machinery that had killed Ensign England and 428 of his shipmates in the first place. Now, in the spring of 1944, she was running supplies to stranded troops on Bougainville, spotted by an Allied patrol plane and reported to Escort Division 39. The three destroyer escorts formed a sweep line 4,000 yards apart and closed in. England made the first sonar contact on the 19th of May. The I-16 did not make it easy. Her captain fishtailed hard, swinging the stern side to side to scramble the sonar returns, breaking contact and forcing England to reacquire her again and again. A slow, exhausting dance of a few knots and a few degrees that could stretch on for the better part of an hour before either side gained anything. Pendleton, watching the plot rather than the wheel, waited for a clean lock before he gave the order to fire. The first salvo missed. A second salvo. One hit landed, and still the submarine kept moving. A third attempt, another miss. It was well past 2 in the afternoon before England's sonar locked on cleanly one more time, and Pendleton gave the order that would become familiar to his crew over the coming days. Fire Hedgehogs! This time the explosion came up through the water, hard enough to lift England's own stern and throw sailors off their feet on deck. For a moment, more than one man aboard thought they had been the ones hit, that a torpedo fired in desperation had found them instead. Then oil began spreading across the surface, followed by wreckage, broken furniture, torn metal, the last of the supplies that were never going to reach Bougainville. The I-16 was gone, taking with her whatever was left of the crew that had once helped launch a midget submarine into Pearl Harbor. England had her first kill, and Pendleton's men, most of them at their first real taste of combat, learned in a single afternoon what silence meant and what it did not. In the days between, another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Navy bombers had already found and destroyed one of the NA line boats, RO-117, from the air. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, was not willing to assume that submarine had been prowling those waters alone, and once intercepted signals confirmed that Toyoda had strung a wider net of boats across the region, he ordered Escort Division 39 to sweep the surrounding sea. It was that order that put George, Raby, and England directly into the path of what came next. 3 days later, in the black hours before dawn on the 22nd of May, radar aboard the USS George picked up a faint surface contact. This was RO-106, one of Toyota's own NA line boats, smaller and faster than the I-16, and built for exactly this kind of ambush work. The Roe-class coastal type could make roughly 14 knots on the surface and 8 submerged, quick enough to dart in for a strike and slip away again before a target could react. Which was exactly why Toyota had chosen boats like her to picket a 200-mile line, rather than risk his larger fleet submarines. Visibility that night was close to nothing. Radar was the only thing standing between the 3 American ships and a submarine they could not otherwise have found at all. George's searchlight caught RO-106 just as she began to dive, and George fired first. The Hedgehogs vanished into the dark water without a sound. 10 minutes later, England re-established sonar contact and fired her own salvo. Again, nothing. For a stretch of minutes that must have felt far longer to the men on both sides, the American ships circled a patch of black water, holding a target they could hear but not hit. And the Japanese crew below held as still and as quiet as a hull full of machinery ever can, waiting to see whether the pinging overhead would move on or come back. Then RO-106 did something no one aboard England expected. Instead of running, she turned back toward her pursuers. Whether to fire her own torpedoes or simply to throw off the hunt, no one on the American side would ever know for certain. What she gave Pendleton, without meaning to, was a clean shot. The mortars went out, and this time 3 explosions followed in quick succession. An oil stain spread across the dark water where the submarine had been. To this day, no one is entirely sure whether England's Hedgehogs finished RO-106 outright, or whether her own crew scuttled a crippled boat rather than be taken. Either way, England's second kill was confirmed. 3 days, 2 submarines. The pace did not slow. On the 23rd, an Allied aircraft spotted RO-104 surfacing roughly 250 miles north of New Ireland, and by 6 in the morning, radar aboard the USS Raby had her at 4 miles. RO-104 dove before the ships could close for a clean strike, and when Raby's Hedgehogs went out, they found only water. Circling for another pass, the submarine tried something new. Acoustic jamming pulses pumped into the water to confuse the American sonar men and scatter their aim, a trick that filled the destroyer escort's headphones with false echoes and made every returning ping a question instead of an answer. It worked for a while, buying RO-104 several more minutes of open water than she had any right to expect. It was England, again, that broke through. A first attack missed. A second did not. Nearly a dozen contact-fused rounds struck the hull in the space of a few seconds, and the explosion that followed was unmistakable. The sound of a pressure hull tearing apart underwater. England dropped 13 depth charges afterward, making certain there would be no crawling away this time. By afternoon, the wreckage had confirmed it. Kill number 3. The following night brought RO-116, caught by Georgia's radar 7 miles off and immediately diving for cover. England's first salvo of 4 Hedgehogs produced nothing. No explosion, no sound at all. For hours, the 3 ships combed the same stretch of ocean, running search patterns over water that gave back nothing. No oil, no debris, no confirmation one way or the other. The kind of silence that could mean a clean escape as easily as a clean miss. It was only when dawn began to lighten the water that they found their answer. An oil slick, stretching for miles, with fragments of decking scattered through it. RO-106 had gone down cleanly. RO-116 did not. She had been hit hard enough to cripple her, but not to finish her outright, and she limped away from the fight before her wounds caught up with her days later, dying somewhere out of sight of the ships that had wounded her. It would be a full month before the Imperial Japanese Navy confirmed she and everyone aboard her were gone. A month in which her name simply stopped appearing in Toyoda's reports, without anyone in Tokyo being certain why. For England's crew, it was victory number 4, but it came at a cost they could measure themselves. The ship was low on fuel and nearly out of Hedgehog rounds. To keep hunting, they needed to reach Manus Island and resupply. They did not get there without one more fight. 100 nautical miles short of Seadler Harbor, radar aboard both Raby and England picked up a fresh contact, RO-108. By any reasonable measure, this was a hunt the division should have passed on. The ships were tired, low on fuel, low on ammunition, crews running on whatever sleep they could grab between watches. And Pendleton sent them back into the hunt anyway, rather than let a submarine slip past unchallenged on his own doorstep. Raby went in first, dodging one of the submarine's own attacks, and firing a salvo that RO-108 evaded at the last possible second, a near miss on both sides that could easily have gone the other way. It was England's turn again. Hedgehogs went out, found the hull, and the underwater detonations that followed echoed across the water, loud enough for every man on all 3 ships to hear. No ambiguity this time, no wait for morning light to confirm it. Kill number 5. The following morning, the battered division limped into Manus, refueled, rearmed, and loaded fresh Hedgehog rounds for whatever was left to finish. It was the first real pause any of the 3 crews had taken since clearing Purvis Bay. Hours rather than days. Just long enough to eat a hot meal, patch what needed patching, and load the racks back to full before Pendleton took his ships out again. What was left was reinforcement, and one final, stubborn holdout. A second hunter-killer group joined the effort, built around the escort carrier USS Hodgett Bay, with the destroyers Hazelwood and McCord, and the destroyer escort Spangler screening her. Where Escort Division 39 hunted by sonar alone, a carrier group like this one could put aircraft into the air to search far wider stretches of ocean than any surface ship's radar could cover, spotting a submarine on the surface from miles further out and vectoring the destroyers in behind it. Combined with George, Raby, and England, it meant Toyoda's last picket boats were now being hunted from above and below at once. By now, Tokyo understood what was happening to the NA line and sent out urgent orders for every remaining boat to evade the American hunters at any cost. Most obeyed, diving deep and vanishing into open ocean rather than risk contact. RO-105 did not. Whether her crew never received the warning or chose to hold their station anyway, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that by staying, they gambled everything. Hazelwood made contact with RO-105 in the early hours of the 30th of May and dropped a pattern of depth charges before the submarine could dive clear. It failed. What followed was unlike anything the division had faced in the previous 5 kills. RO-105 fought back with everything a cornered submarine had, dumping oil and debris to fake her own destruction, fishtailing on and off sonar, slipping just out of range pass after pass, running a defense so convincing that more than once the American crews believed they had already finished her. George and Raby hunted her for hours, 16 separate attacks between them, every single one coming up empty. 16 salvos of hedgehogs and depth charges, hundreds of pounds of torpex thrown at a single small hull, and not one contact fuse had found her. At one point, RO-105 surfaced directly between the 2 American ships, so close that neither could fire without risking the other. A piece of positioning, either desperate or brilliant, depending on whether it was chosen or accidental. For the length of that single suspended moment, the hunters were the ones who could not act. 2 warships staring at their target and at each other, guns silent, while the submarine that had already survived 16 attacks sat exposed on the surface between them and somehow walked away with it. Then word came that Japanese aircraft were inbound, drawn by the hours of radio traffic and depth charge fire, and the hunters risked becoming the hunted if they stayed in one place any longer. The order came down to withdraw. Pendleton was not ready to let it end there. 6 kills within reach, and he had not yet had a clean shot at RO-105 himself. He radioed Commander Hamilton Haynes aboard George, asking for one more chance before pulling out, a request that meant keeping his own exhausted crew and his own low supply of Hedgehog rounds, in a fight they had every reason to walk away from. Haynes gave him the chance. Nearly 30 hours after the first contact, roughly a day and a quarter of one submarine dodging 3 warships without a single hit landing, England got her run. RO-105 tried to twist away below the surface one more time, and it made no difference. The Hedgehogs went out, the sea erupted. 2 explosions confirmed the hit, and the shock rolled up through England's own deck, hard enough to stagger the men standing on it. 6 submarines, 12 days. Nothing like it had happened before in the history of anti-submarine warfare, and nothing like it has happened since. When the news reached George, Commander Haynes radioed Pendleton 4 words that summed up what every man in the division was thinking. God damn it. How do you do it? Before we get to why it mattered beyond that stretch of ocean, one small thing worth doing. If anyone in your family served aboard a destroyer escort, hunted submarines in the Pacific, or wore a Japanese uniform on the other side of that hunt, leave their name in the comments below. These crews are almost entirely gone now, and a name written down where someone else can read it is a small way of keeping them present. Before we get to what those 6 kills meant for the wider war, it is worth sitting for a moment with what they meant to the men who actually lived through them, on both sides of the Hedgehog salvos. A coastal submarine of the RO class carried a crew of somewhere around 40 to 50 men, packed into a hull barely wide enough to pass one another in the passageways, breathing recycled air for days at a stretch while they waited on a picket line for a fleet that never arrived. 6 boats meant something close to 250 men, and almost none of them ever knew what killed them. There was no torpedo wake to see coming, no aircraft overhead to dive for cover from. There was only a silence that had always meant safety before, broken without warning by an explosion that arrived faster than sound could carry any kind of alarm. On the American side, the cost was almost nothing by comparison. A handful of men thrown to a deck plate, a few days of exhaustion stacked on exhaustion. That imbalance, more than any single tactic, is the plainest measure of what changed in the Pacific War by the spring of 1944. Now here is what those 6 kills actually cost the men who ordered the NA line into existence. Escort Division 39 had sunk 5 of the 7 submarines Toyoda sent out to watch for the American fleet. For 2 more weeks, the division kept hunting, unaware that the picket line was already broken beyond repair. The last 2 survivors, RO-109 and RO-112, pulled back after officials in Tokyo finally accepted there was no point sending them to their deaths for nothing. With the submarine screen gone, the Imperial Japanese Navy went into the coming battle effectively blind. Fleet movements it should have tracked went unseen. Fuel and forces meant to be held in reserve got misallocated against threats that were not where anyone thought they were. Ships and aircraft shifted toward guesses instead of confirmed positions, because confirmed positions no longer existed. Island garrisons that should have been reinforced sat exposed, while Toyoda's staff argued over where the blow would actually land, believing wrongly that the loss of contact meant the American fleet had turned south toward Palau or the Philippines rather than the Marianas. Toyoda began shifting his own forces in the wrong direction at exactly the moment he needed to be moving in the right one. The entire foundation of Operation Ago, a plan built on knowing where the American fleet was before it struck, had collapsed before a single Japanese carrier plane left its deck. In June came the battle Toyoda had staked everything on, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His rebuilt carrier force sailed in expecting to catch the Americans by surprise, the entire plan resting on submarines like the ones England had just spent 12 days destroying. Instead, without the reconnaissance that was supposed to warn them what they were flying into, Japanese pilots ran straight into a wall of radar-directed fighter control and squadrons of American aviators flying the new Grumman Hellcat, a fighter faster, better armored, and flown by more experienced pilots than almost anything Japan could put in the air by that point in the war. In a matter of hours, more than 350 Japanese aircraft went down, many of them before they ever reached the American ships they had been sent to sink. History remembers it as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. It broke Japanese naval air power for good. The same air power that had crossed an ocean to strike Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier. On the morning Ensign John England went below for the last time. Japan would build more carriers before the war ended. She would never again put together a force of trained naval pilots capable of meeting the Americans in the air on anything like even terms. The submarine force fared no better in the months that followed. The boats lost to Escort Division 39 in May were never replaced in any way that mattered. And for the remainder of the war, Japan's dwindling undersea fleet was pushed further and further from any role resembling the reconnaissance screen Toyoda had once relied on. Hunted in turn by American destroyer escorts that only grew more numerous and better equipped as the fighting moved closer to Japan itself. USS England received the Presidential Unit Citation and 10 battle stars for her service. Commander Pendleton was awarded the Navy Cross, and not long after the submarine hunt, was reassigned to lead a different escort division up in Alaska, a posting about as far removed from the tropical hunt off the Bismarck Archipelago as the Navy could have found for him, handing England over to a new commanding officer for the rest of the war. Through the remainder of 1944, the ship that had spent 12 days hunting submarines went back to the far less dramatic work of convoy escort, standing watch over slow columns of transports and cargo ships rather than chasing sonar contacts through the dark, helping build the chain of forward bases that would carry the war toward Japan itself. It was, by any measure, quieter work than the hunt that had made her name, and for the better part of a year she did it without a headline to show for it. She would not see action like that again until the 9th of May, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, in the middle of a campaign where the Kamikaze had become the single greatest threat any American ship on picket duty could face. 3 Japanese aircraft came in on a suicide run. England's own anti-aircraft fire caught the first one and set it burning, but the pilot held his course anyway, choosing to ride a dying aircraft into his target rather than break off, and the burning plane struck her starboard side just below the bridge. The bomb it carried went off on impact. Combat Air Patrol shot down the other 2 before they reached her. 37 of England's crew were killed or listed as missing, 25 more wounded, and the men still standing fought the fires that followed until they had saved their ship, the same discipline that had carried them through 16 fruitless attacks on RO-105 now turned toward keeping their own ship afloat. She was towed to Kuramaretto for emergency repairs, then made her own way back to the United States under her own power. A ship that had survived a suicide attack, limping most of the way across the Pacific she had once hunted submarines across. Arriving in Philadelphia in the middle of July, for permanent repairs and conversion to a different role entirely. The repairs never happened. The war ended first. On the 15th of October, 1945, not quite 2 years after she was first commissioned, USS England was taken out of service. She was sold for scrap the following year, her hull broken up for metal within 2 years of a record no other ship in her Navy, or any Navy, has matched since. In 1963, a new USS England was commissioned in her honor. A guided missile cruiser, built for an entirely different kind of Navy, one that measured its power in radar horizons and missile ranges, rather than Hedgehog salvos. That second England served off the coast of Vietnam through years of a war her namesake never lived to see. And decades after that she sailed again during the Gulf War, in the campaign that became known as Desert Storm, carrying a name that by then had already earned its place in the service twice over. But the record set by the first England, in 12 days off the Bismarck Archipelago in the spring of 1944, was never matched by any ship that came after her, including the one that carried her name. So ask yourself the question the title of this asked at the start. How does one small, hastily built destroyer escort sink 6 enemy submarines in 12 days, a feat no ship managed before her and none has managed since? The honest answer is not about one lucky captain or one extraordinary crew, though Pendleton and his men were both skilled and stubborn in exactly the right measure. The real answer is that 2 separate American advances arrived on the same stretch of Pacific water at the same time. One was invisible, codebreakers at Pearl Harbor who had already read Japan's picket line into existence before it ever went on station. The other was mechanical, a British-designed weapon that solved the one blind spot that had let submarines survive depth charge attacks for 2 years of war. Neither advantage alone would have done it. Together, they turned a hunt that should have taken months into one that took less than 2 weeks. And underneath both of those advances sits the plainest fact of all. Admiral Toyoda built his entire plan on the assumption that a submarine sent out alone across open water was, by its nature, safe. Unseen, unheard, impossible to find in time to matter. That assumption had been true for most of the war. It stopped being true the moment American industry could turn out radar and sonar-equipped destroyer escorts by the 100 and hand every one of them a weapon that did not need to guess where a submarine was hiding. 7 boats went out to be the eyes of the Japanese fleet. 5 of them never made it home, and the 2 that did were ordered to run rather than watch. It is worth sitting with how differently this could have gone. A submarine that held her nerve a little longer. A Hedgehog salvo that missed one more time than it hit. A division that ran out of fuel an hour before instead of an hour after finding a contact. And the record this video opened with would read 4 kills, or 3. A strong patrol rather than a legend. The margin between an unmatched record and an ordinary one was not large. It was measured in single salvos, single sonar locks, single decisions to keep hunting instead of turning for home. Look at what actually beat the NA line, and you will not find a single dramatic weapon or a single brilliant tactic behind it. You will find a stack of ordinary things arriving at the same place at the same time. A code-breaking unit reading a 6-day voyage before it finished. A weapon engineered specifically to fix one blind spot in an older piece of equipment. A production line turning out escort ships faster than an enemy could build the submarines meant to counter them. A young captain willing to keep his exhausted crew at sea for one more shot rather than let a target slip away. None of those 4 things alone sinks 6 submarines in 12 days. Put together, they made an entire class of Japanese ship. The very tool built to give Toyota eyes on the battle. Functionally useless before the battle it was meant to enable had even begun. There is a quieter thread running underneath all of this, worth holding on to at the end. The ship that broke Japan's early warning line and helped clear the sky for the slaughter at the Philippine Sea never fired a shot in that battle itself. She did her part weeks before it began, in the dark, against targets she never saw with her own eyes, using nothing but sound and a weapon built to solve one very specific problem. No newsreel camera followed her out of Purvis Bay. No headline back home named her the way it would later name the carriers and the battleships that fought the battle her work made possible. And she carried, the whole time, the name of a 21-year-old ensign who went back into a sinking battleship 3 times to save other men, and did not come out the 4th time. USS. England never got the chance to avenge Pearl Harbor with her own guns in a fleet battle, in front of the kind of audience that remembers a name for generations. She did it quietly instead, 12 days at a time, in water most people watching the news back home never even heard the name of, against an enemy that never once saw her coming. If you want more stories told this way, with the research done and the men remembered, subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.